This is the public domain work, Bidwell's Travels from Wall Street to London Prison, 15 Years in Solitude by Austin Bidwell. Bidwell's Travels. FROM Wall Street to London Prison, 15 Years in Solitude. Freed a human wreck. A wonderful survival. AND a more wonderful rise. INTHE world. TODAY, CHAS, a national reputation. AS a writer, speaker ANDI, is considered AN authority, ONAL social problems. HWAS, tried ATTH Dale, AND sentenced FOR life. Charged WITHTHEL 1000 million forgery, ONTHEBANKOF England. TH story, shows THTH, events OFH life, surpass THE imaginations, OFOUR, famous novelists, ITS, thrilling scenes, hairbreadth escapes AND, marvelous adventures, RENOT, a record OF crime, BUTARE, proofs OFTAT, 490 pages. 80 graphic illustrations. Copyrighted 1897 by Bidwell Publishing Company, Hartford, CONN editorial New York Herald, referring to a whole page. If an American dramatist or novelist had taken for the groundwork of a play or work of fiction the story of the Bidwell family today related on another page of the Herald, all European critics would have told him that the story was too American, too vast in its outlines, too high in its colors, too merely big in fact. The story has its lesson. The play is not a mere spectacle. The lesson is that in the doing and undoing of wrong, the Bidwell family expended enough ability and energy to stock a good many reigning European families for generations. Let the comedy humane write itself, and it will outright Balzac. Honourable Lyman J. Gage. Having read the Bidwell book one, believe it will benefit everyone to read this marvellous history of human experience. Aside from its dramatic interest, there are great moral lessons involved of especial value to young men and employees in positions of trust. Therefore, I recommend this book as unique and a valuable acquisition for home and office. From Chase Emstead, Union League Club, New York. Dear Sir, I read your book with a good deal of interest and would like to change it for a higher-priced binding if you have one. The Worcester Spy. Mr. Bidwell's book has been compared with Dumas' famous Monte Cristo. The extraordinary character of its adventures indeed would render it dramatic and powerful as fiction, as human truth. It is simply overwhelming. No one can read this book unmoved. From every conceivable standpoint, physiological, sociological, and literary, it is a marvel. Philip W. Mwen. Mr. Mohn, of Washburn and Mohn, Worcester, Mass., writes, I have read Mr. George Bidwell's book with the deepest interest. It is a book that deserves to be widely read, and I am very glad to recommend it. A niece of Oliver Wendell Holmes writes, few books have so stirred my mind for years as the book by George Bidwell. Hearing of the book, prejudice immediately seized me against it. The history given by himself, to be interesting at all, must be sensational, therefore disastrous to morals. So avowed prejudice thought, and, determined to find fault, I began this remarkable history. ITIS, Impossible TOFIND Fault YITHTH book, which is valuable AND wonderfully absorbing. From Ira D. Sankey-esque. Mr. George Bidwell, dear Sir, I have read with great interest your book, and believe it will do much good among young men wherever read. Your life is a proof, and your book a burning record of the truth that whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. I believe in throwing light into all the dark places of this life, that men, seeing the dangers, they may avoid them. I wish you success. From Honourable Robert G. Ingersoll. George Bidwell, ESQ, my dear Sir, knowing as I do that you will tell a candid story of your career, I believe you will do good. Crime springs mostly from a lack of intelligence and imagination. Only the foolish can think that the practice of vice is the road to joy. As a matter of fact, the wrong does not pay. You have, in your remarkable book, made this fact perfectly clear, and you would enforce this great truth on the platform. In the world of crime, success is failure. Good luck to you. Reverend Dr. Edward Beecher writes, I recommend this book to the friends of morality. Office of Streets Insurance Agency, Hartford, Conn. Mr. George Bidwell, dear sir. A clergyman consulted with me regarding his son, who had fallen into bad associations, taken part in many small thefts, and seemed hardened against shame or dread of exposure. I believe the mean, dangerous boy has become a man by reading your book. Yours very truly, F.F. Street, Hartford, Con. Hartford Daily Times. This autobiography is a story of thrilling interest. Contents: a NEWYORK Herald editorial. Chapter 1. Brooklyn Public Schools in the 60s. Old. Number 13. Parents suited to the Golden Age, a curious preparation for the battle of life. Knew that Brutus slew Caesar. George III was a bad fellow who got a tea kettle thrown at his head in Boston Harbor. My model home library. An innocent leaves home. 19. Chapter 2. In a broker's office, a nice old gentleman, situation in Wall Street, an up-to-date young man, visions of wealth, speculations, Wall Street in the 60s, the Honourable John Morrissey, ex-pugilist, his famous gambling house. I try a game of faro midnight banquets. I have entered the Primrose Way. 24. Chapter 3. Pleasure before business. Result of that method, on Financial Rocks, James, otherwise Jimmy Irving. He was a model chief of detectives, police headquarters, 300 Mulberry Street in the early 70s. He takes me for a drive out Harlem Lane, a trio of detectives. They make a startling proposition, a 10,000 temptation, mental conflicts. I, and not be poor, c'est le premier pas qui coûte. 28. Chapter 4. History of the famous Lord Bonsteel, on The Office. 3 sneaks stumble on a fortune. A 1,250,000 tin box. Dazed crooks. What to do with their white elephant. Excitement at police headquarters. Bullard et al. A violin virtuoso, superintendent of police Kelso, presents a 500 silver punch bowl to the daughter of Boss Tweed, paid for with stolen cash. 36. Chapter 5. Police protectors, New York gangs, Irving and Co., give me 80,000 Lord bonds to sell abroad, a midnight farewell, alone on the sea, when Jim Fisk owned our judges. Chief Irving plans a famous bank robbery, his 3 burglar confederates. 48. Chapter 6. The bank looted, Irving notified by bank officials. His feigned surprise, hunts the burglars, but divides the plunder at his own house, Count Shinburn and his palace on the Rhine, 20 years later. 58. Chapter 7. I arrive in Paris, field of Waterloo, meet the Antwerp chief of police. He is on trail, a Dutch Van Tromp and the Countess Windsorode, his dream of bliss and tragic death. My negotiations in Frankfurt on the Main. 65. Chapter 8. Marpagot and Weisweller, bankers, François Blanc, the gambler king, his casinos at Monte Carlo, Homburg and Wiesbaden. I meet Van Tromp's countess, outlived her beauty, now a hanger, on at the Rouge et Noir tables, takes my advice, marries a rich burgher, becomes a good stepmother, her pious end an epitaph. 73. Chapter 9. I sell the 80,000 bonds, reach London safely, drifting, success in crime, a failure, a desolate woman, beautiful barmaid show, Westminster Abbey, good resolutions, sail home, Irving at the wharf, meet at Taylor's Hotel, the total, I have another job for you, a fool's game. 84. Chapter 10. Edwin James, QC and a possible Lord Chancellor of England, his extravagance, on the borderland of crime, he oversteps disbarred, comes to New York, Richard O'Gorman's great heart, the Breerwell case, a dark plot. 20,000 out of Wall Street, J. Cook & Co. Narrowly escaped loss of 240,000, Chief Irving and the plot detective George Elder not in our ring. Accidentally he appears and thwarts our plans. 94. Chapter 11. Eastward Ho, the James and Brea exit. Ezra, the shrewd lawyer. 3 unhappy daughters. He marries one. Detects forged will. Flight of Brea to Montana. A sunrise surprise at Butte City. James returns to London, fills a pauper's grave instead of a Lord Chancellor's. 114. Chapter 12. Bordeaux, Marseilles and Lyons donate 50,000, a bad quarter of an hour, eggs and peasant women, sweets to the sweet. A mysterious stranger disappears among the tombs. 123. Chapter 13. A starry talk. Contrast between Mac's philosophy and his errand. A financial trip through Germany, from Leipzig Fair to London, return loaded with thalers. 132. Chapter 14. A drive to Hampton Court. Send 10,000 police tribute to New York, discussing the Bank of England in the throne room at Windsor Castle. Believe it to be a fossil institution. Green, the tailor, introduces me to bank. No references required. Joy that ends in sorrow. 142. Chapter 15. Voyage to Rio Janeiro, the Lady of the Lusitania. A Swedish colonel's party of English engineers. A bibulous chaplain, modern buccaneers. Scenes at Bordeaux, crossing the line. Father Neptune's visit, fun at sea. Arrival in Rio, Mauer and Co. Our plans. 154. Chapter 16. $50,000 on bogus letters of credit. Visit to a coffee plantation. Slaves dining. Dangerous errors in letters of credit. A nervous day. An eagle-eyed Hebrew. Show me your letter of credit. Mac in a corner. A bold coup strategy. Can we get out of Brazil? 160. Chapter 17. Brazilian law. Visit police headquarters. A douceur to the chief. In a tight spot. A doctored passport. A detective on trail. Who ingratiates himself into Mac's confidence. Manoeuvres. The detective on a wild goose chase. Safely on board. A distinguished party in a rowboat. A stern chase off at last. 173. Chapter 18. Rio to Buenos Aires. Return and meet Mac in Paris. Determined to abandon a dangerous business. Vienna, watching the game. Must have more money. Good resolutions vanish. Return to London. Determined to assault the Bank of England. Deposit 67,000. 186. Chapter 19. Bank of England requires no references. Letter from Paris. A gilded American young man, duped into marriage with a Parisienne mondaine, a ghost at Monte Carlo, in a Greenwood mausoleum, earthly happiness and the world to come. 193. Chapter 20. A Council of War. Description of bills of exchange. Frederick Albert Warren, the great American railway contractor. The great bank proves fallible. Discounts bogus bills of exchange. 200. Chapter 21. Draw fabulous sums, bags of sovereigns by the cabload, in a French railway wreck. Baron Alphonse de Rothschild, head of the Paris house. A famous L6000 draft. 206. Chapter 22. Last call at the Bank of England. Noise arrives in London. An artful plot. Introduce noise. Plan now complete. Our wise forefathers. No change in a century. Our paper is discounted. Prepare for flight. Thou shalt not. 214. Chapter 23. $50,000 a day. The golden shower continues to fall. Operation shrouded in midnight darkness. No possibility of discovery. Finish and begin again. Amazing oversight. Picture goes once too often. Noise arrested. Unparalleled excitement on the stock exchange. 224. Chapter 24. Consternation. A mob of bankers. The financial world shaken. Noise taken to Newgate. Mac cables Irving. His flight to France. Sails from Havre on board Thuringia. Arrested at quarantine. The Pinkertons on trail. 236. Chapter 25. Hunted through Ireland. 2,500 reward for my capture. Detectives spot me at the Cork railway station. Obliged to abandon taking passage by the ill-fated Atlantic. A game of hare and hounds. Eluding a detective trap. English misrule in Ireland. Am taken for a priest. A typographical thunderbolt at Lismore. An early morning walk. A ride on an Irish jaunting car on the road to Clonmel. Shelter in a shebeen. How thirsty souls get the crathur in Ireland. A good old Irish. Lady, pursuit and refuge in a ruined cottage at Cahir. 248. Chapter 26. An unceremonious call. I am a Fenian leader. A story told in the dark. Malloy helps my escape on an Irish jaunting car. Eggs. A policeman anxious to obtain the £500 reward. Dublin again. A Jewess's blessing. I turn Russian. And later become a Frenchman. Belfast detectives. Escape into Scotland. The other side of the story. A Bow Street detective's adventures while hunting me through Ireland. Cross-questioning my jaunting car driver. A cold water cure. Hot on the trail, not in the fort. A fruitless hunt. Many innocents arrested. Malloy. Becomes a know-nothing. 261. Chapter 27. A marriage at the American Embassy in Paris. Anxious moments at Versailles. Off for Spain. Crossing the Pyrenees. Gunshots. Train off the track. Captured by Carlist bandits. Released. Through the pass on ox carts. A mountain blizzard. Camp in a snowstorm. Mutiny. A morning dream. 275. Chapter 28. A Carlist officer. A picturesque caravan. Arrival at Burgos. Startling telegrams. Revolution at Madrid. The railway seized. My party in a trap. Madrid Cathedral and a bullfight. A special train proves a slow train. No news, good news. 292. Chapter 29. Arrival in Santander. Gloomy forebodings. Sail for Cuba. Watch the Pyrenees sink in the sea. Two Sisters of Charity. Innocents on a voyage. Circus at St. Thomas. Sunset gun in Havana. 30 seconds change my destiny. 301. Chapter 30. Slavery in Cuba. Life in Havana. The £1 million forgery discovered, my opinion asked. Trip to the Isle of Pines. The Cuban rebels. A battlefield. A slave cook. The missionary and the cannibal. Going into the interior. 312. Chapter 31. On the Caribbean. A motley cargo. Turning turtles and shark fishing. A dinner party in Havana proves a surprise party. Captain John Curtin of the Pinkertons appears on the scene. Consternation among the diners. Offer the captain 50,000 for 10-minute start. No, I shoot him, struggle and capture, in the arsenal. 327. Chapter 32. Friendly Spanish officials, plots to escape, leap for liberty, escape out of Havana, travel the beach nights, refuge in the jungle days, construct a raft, food and water gone, but pluck at the fore. I will join the rebels and win military laurels, man proposes, but 338. Chapter 33. Creeping across a bridge, sentries discover me, they challenge, Quyen va? They fire, flight and escape on the raft. A tropical night swim, sharks everywhere, knife between my teeth, regain the shore, nearing the rebel camp. The black soldiers surprise and capture me. I strike the captain. He dashes at me with a bayonet, stopped by a woman, desperation. 355. Chapter 34. Back in Havana, Curtin's story, extradited, Spain delivers me to England. Pinkertons escort me on board steamer, arrival at Plymouth, Newgate at last, when time is old and have forgotten himself. 372. Chapter 35. Life in Newgate, legal sharks, a pattern solicitor, a lame defence. Before Lord Mayor Waterloo. Trial at the Old Bailey. Thronging crowds. Days of mental torture. Jury retires. Suspense. Guilty. 383. Chapter 36. A modern Jeffreys. Penal servitude for life. End of the Primrose Way. A resolve. Will fortune ever smile again? Newgate to Chatham Prison. A cocky little major. You were sent here to work. In the mud, night and silence. 387. Chapter 37. Events of the first day. Hopeless outlook. lack of mental and physical food. A Shakespeare won and hope dawns, in the infirmary, effects of prolonged imprisonment. 401. Chapter 38. Prison management, warders under military discipline, their long hours and small pay, their character and antecedents, English prison system not reformatory, turns out murderers, prison pets, rats, mice and beetles. 404. Chapter 39. A genius, strange story of Arthur Heap, unwise parents, driven from home, temptation and fall, in a lunatic asylum, escapes naked in a storm, clothes secured from a scarecrow, rearrested, serves 5 years, to America and return, again behind the bars. 417. Chapter 40. English prisons, schools for crime, 2 prison aid societies, United States laws evaded, snug berths for Reverend Barnacles, contributions go for salaries, no benefit to ex-prisoners, how discharged prisoners are hustled to the United States. 426. Chapter 41. Reverend Mr. Whiteley, how to stop influx of foreign criminals. Foster an example. Whiteley, Secretary of Aid Society, sends Foster to sea, his arrival in Chicago, meets an old prison chum. Turns detective, Chicago justices, Foster's story, human tigers, a plot and 20,000, a letter and diamond pin, in the toils again. 430. Chapter 42. A Gettysburg veteran, in the Wethersfield, Tite State Prison, makes and conceals a set of burglars' tools, liberated, returns and burglarizes the prison, boatload of blunder, captured, 16 years more in prison, then goes to England, gets 20 years, joins me at Chatham. 436. Chapter 43. The Fenians at Chatham, Dr. Gallagher, McCarty, O'Brien and others. We become friends, excavating the Chatham ship basin, starvation and despair, self-mutilation of an arm or leg to reach the hospital, release and death of McCarty, Gallagher breaks down, speedy release or death for him. 443. Chapter 44. Fenian prisoners in English prisons, McCarthy, O'Brien, a plan miscarried, in the Tolls severe punishments, Curtin, Daly, Egan, poor Dr. Gallagher. 447. Chapter 45. A Dictionary and Life of the Prophet Jeremiah versus a Shakespeare. Prison hospital proves a paradise, nature's compensations, reality not so terrible as imagined, human nature unchangeable. 453. Chapter 46. Public opinion within says the same as outside, a sensible fellow, pluck wins, roses scarce, thorns plenty, woe to mutineers for more bread, sentiment banished, resistance crushed, English judges are autocrats, no appeal. 459. Chapter 47. Hard lines, a boaster, a veneered flunky. Billy Treacle's aunt dies again, Frederick Barton and his vain petitions, I give him a pointer, his inherited fortune fake, surreptitious mail route, warders as letter carriers. 463. Chapter 48. 16,000 acre tea plantation in India and £60,000 imaginary inheritance. Barton becomes a great man. The plot thickens. Letters from London. Smith discharged. Petition for Barton. Smith presents it at Home Office. Home Secretary swallows the bait. Barton's triumphant release. His imaginary fortune does not materialize. 466. Chapter 49. Tantalizing the Home Secretary, refused a letter sheet, petition the Home Office for one, sarcasm about Barton's release on my sub rosa petition, good conduct fails, feigned wealth wins freedom for Barton, apropos quotation from Gertie, Sir Vernon Harcourt and his opinion, I tread dangerous ground. 471. Chapter 50. Niblo Clark, the mysterious 3 R's, his characteristic verses, my 10th anniversary at Chatham. All efforts fail and 15 years gone forever, despairing when good news comes. My sister in England, George freed. Hope returns and abides. George gets James G. Blaine, J. Arge. Russell and others to intercede, fresh failures. Home Secretary Matthews won't, George and my sister will. Which will wear the other out? George and sister win, night and gloom in my cell. These walls have frowned on me for 20 years. Warders' tramps on stone corridor arouse me. Door opens, you are free. First sight of stars in 20 years, I shout, 'twas like a prayer. God is good. 478. Note TOTHE Public, the Honourable Lyman J. Gage, Dr. Funk and hundreds of others have said that my book should be put at a price which would place it within the reach of every young man, and so on hitherto. It has been sold by subscription at $3.50, $5 and $10 half per copy. The 5 editions printed having been easily sold at those prices. Notwithstanding the thousands of friends their circulation has made, I did not care to have my family name go any further in this connection than financial needs required in working for the release of the men still undergoing life sentences in English prisons. At last, however, certain influence causes me to let it go in the revised and improved form here presented, and may it prove as valuable and engrossing to the general public as it has to 20,000 subscribers to former editions. George Bidwell. Chapter 1. There been wisdom there. We lived in South Brooklyn, near to old number 13, the DeGraw Street Public School. To that I was sent, and there got all the education I was ever fated to have at any school, except the School of Life and Experience. I attended for some years, and even now I cannot recall without a smile the absurd incompetency of everyone connected with the institution and their utter ignorance of the art of imparting knowledge to children. At home, I had picked up that grand art of reading, and went to school to learn the other 2 R's, with any trifle that I might come across floating around promiscuously. I certainly hope our much-lauded public schools are conducted on better lines now than then. If not, they are frauds from the foundation. The instruction in number 13 was so lax and radically bad that the whole governing body and the principal ought to have been sent to the penitentiary on the charge of false pretense for drawing their salaries and giving nothing in return. And yet I remember when examination day came, instead of the committee investigating the progress of the pupils, it usually turned into a mere hallelujah chorus upon our grand public school system. Here is a remarkable fact. I seldom missed a promotion and passed from grade to grade until within 2 years I found myself in Junior A, the next to the highest class in the school, just as ignorant as my classmates, and that is saying much. It was all very pitiful. My blood boils even now when I think of the traitors chosen and paid to see me fully equipped and armed to begin the battle of life, who left me with phantom weapons which would shiver into fragments at the first shock of conflict. I left Junior A of old number 13 with its algebra, logic, philosophy, heaven save the word, and advanced grammar, unable to write a grammatical sentence. I had been taught spelling out of an expositor, a sort of pocket dictionary containing about 1,500 words. Most of these, with their definitions, parrot-like, I had learned to spell, but never once in all my school experience had I been taught the derivation of a single word. Indeed, I took it for granted that in the good old days Adam had invented the words much as he named the animals, and, of course, supposed that he spoke good English. The knowledge of history I gained at number 13 was strictly limited and exceedingly primitive. I knew the Jews in the old days were a bad lot, that Brutus had slain Caesar, that the Mayflower had landed our fathers on Plymouth Rock, that wicked George the Sir was a tyrant, and that the boys in Boston had thrown a tea kettle at his head. I knew all about our George and the cherry tree, and there my historical knowledge ended. So here I was launched out in the world a model scholar, stamped as proficient in grammar, history, logic, philosophy and arithmetic, but yet in useful knowledge a barbarian, unable to spell or even write a grammatical letter, and unversed in the ways of the world. A world, too, where I would be cast entirely upon my own resources. My home life was happy. My father had lost his grip on the world, but his faith in the unseen remained. My mother, caring little for this life, lived in and for the spiritual. To her heaven was a place as much as the country village where she was born. She was never tired of talking to us children about its golden streets and the rest there after the toils and pains of life. But, boy-like, we discounted all she said, and felt we wanted some of this world before we knocked at the gates of the next. We loved our mother, but her soul was too gentle to keep in restraint hot, fiery youths like my brothers and myself. On the whole, we were good boys, and I suppose caused her no more pain than the average youngsters. Perhaps the keynote of her character can best be found in the following incident, if that which was of daily occurrence could be called an incident. Every night of my life in those days she would come to my bed to pray over me, ever saying, as she kissed me or clasped my hand, "My son, remember, if you were to pass your whole life here in poverty and hardship, it would not much matter so long as you attained to the heavenly rest." This teaching would have been well had she only taught me some worldly wisdom with it, but that all essential knowledge was kept from me, I being left to learn the ways of man in that terrible school of experience. The consequence being that when, after some months, I was launched out in life, I was a ripe and apt victim to be caught in the world's huge snare. In fact, had my parents designed me to become a traveller in the primrose way, they could not have educated me to better purpose. Save when in the school I had never been permitted to associate with other boys, but was kept in the house, and up to my 16th year hardly dreamed there was evil in the world. I was told much about the wicked, but thought that meant those who smoked tobacco or drank whiskey. I hardly thought any women came under that category, but if any, then it must mean those who came around selling apples and oranges. The reader will see that when once away from the shelter of home, in threading the world's devious ways, I would be crossing the roaring torrent on the perilous footing of a spear, all but certain to fall into the flood beneath. During my last year at school, and for a long time after leaving it, my father and mother were never tired of talking about my good education. Possibly they were not very good judges, but I am confident that they, after all, did not realize the importance of a boy being well equipped in that regard. Their thoughts and minds were so bent on the other world, and things unseen bulked so hugely on their mental vision, that there was small space left for things of this earth. They, good, simple souls, were made for and ought to have lived in the golden age, when all men were brave and all women true, where neighbourly eyes reflected the love and faith within. But in our utilitarian days they were sadly out of place, and little wonder if they had lost their way in this world. In their intense longing for the life beyond the grave, their passionate desire to walk the streets of gold, they, by their actions, seemed to forget that we were on this earth, and that we were here with many sharp reminders of the fact. The same guilelessness was manifested in their choice of our home reading. The books I was allowed access to in the house were The Life of King David, The History of Jerusalem, Baxter's Saints' Rest, The Immortal Dreamer's Pilgrim, and Fox's Book of Martyrs. His first martyr is Stephen, and such was my gross ignorance of history that I always supposed Stephen had been martyred by the Church of Rome. Here was mental food for a boy who had his own way to make in the world. Craving other mental food than the Life of David, I used to club pennies with a chum and buy that delectable sheet, Ned Buntline's own, then in fear and trembling would creep to an upper room and read The Haunted House or The Ghost of Castle Ivy, until my hair stood on end in a sort of ecstatic horror, or The Stirring Adventures of Jack the Rover or Pirate Chief, until my brain took fire and a mighty impulse stirred every fibre impelling me to follow in their footsteps. I had remained idly at home for some 6 months after my release from school, when one night my father returned from New York and said, "My son, I have found a situation for you." That was delightful news, and when I went to bed that night I was too excited to sleep. The future was full of colour, red and purple, of course. Happily for me, the future, in all its black misery, was hidden behind those gilded clouds. So now, at 16, I was about to sail out of harbour, and how equipped? Absolutely without education, void of worldly wisdom, and in my boyish brain dividing the world into 2 sections. In one was King David slaying the Philistines or dancing before the ark. In the other was Jack the Rover and the Pirate Chief. How easy to guess the rest, yet I was not a bad boy, far from it. I only needed wise guidance and good companionship, and as the ignorance and crudity of my character dropped off, the innate virtue, mine by lawful heritage, would have been developed. But pitchforked into the wild whirl of Wall Street and its fast set of gilded youth, the gates of the primrose way to destruction were held wide open to my eager feet. Chapter 2. W-A-S ever T-H-U-S. O, of course, I-T-W-A-S. The situation my father had obtained for me was with a sugar broker by the name of Waterbury. He was a partner in a large refinery, his office being in South Water Street. He was a nice, conservative old man, and let things run on easily. His chief clerk, Mr. Ambler, was every inch a gentleman, who, quickly perceiving what an ignoramus I was, out of the goodness of his heart, resolved to teach me something. There were 2 sharp young men in our office. They liked me well enough, but used to guy me unmercifully for my simplicity and clumsiness. One of them, Harry by name, was something of a scapegrace, and soon acquired quite a power over me. I stood in much fear of his ridicule, and frequently did things for which my conscience reproached me rather than stand the fire of his raillery. The greatest harm he did me was in firing my imagination with stories of Wall Street, of the fortunes that were and could be made in the gold room or on 'change. He made tolerably clear the modus operandi of speculators, and I secretly resolved that some day I too would try my fortune. My friend Mr. Ambler's health was bad, and frequent attacks of illness caused him to be away from the office for weeks at a time, and that meant much loss to me. When I had been there about a year, he resigned his position and went as manager for a factory in New Haven. But before leaving, he interested himself so far in my welfare as to secure me a position with a firm of brokers in New Street at a salary of $10 a week. My employers were good fellows, lovers of pleasure and men of the world, not scrupling to talk freely with me of their various adventures out of business hours. I had lost much of my awkwardness and gauche manners, and under the $10 a week arrangement began to dress fairly well. My employers did a brokerage business and speculated as well on their own account. My duties were decidedly light and pleasant, and brought me into contact with some of the sharpest as well as the most famous men in the street. Among them was a brilliant young man of my own age, who took a great fancy to me, and frequently proposed that we should start for ourselves. Being doubtful of my powers, I shrank from risking my scanty funds in any speculative venture. Much to my mother's concern, I had begun attending the theatre, and one night, on my friend Edweed's invitation, I went with him to Niblo's. After the performance we went to supper at Delmonico's, and I was perfectly fascinated by the company and surroundings, going home long past midnight, a different man than I had last left it. The next day, Ed came to the office and invited me to lunch, where, after making some disparaging remarks about the country cut of my garments, he offered to introduce me to his tailor, who was never in a hurry for his money. After business that day, we walked uptown together, and, prompted by Ed, I ordered 150 worth of garments, then went to his outfitter and ordered nearly an equal amount in shirts, ties, gloves, and so on. One amusing result was that when, a few days later, I walked down to our office, comme il faut in garb, my employers raised my salary to $30 a week, but this left me poorer than when I had husbanded my poor little 10. Soon after, piloted by Ed, I ventured $50 on a margin in gold. Unluckily, I won, invested again and again, and within 14 days was 284 ahead. I paid my tailor an outfitter's bill, bought a 100 watch on credit, and gave a wine supper on borrowed money. Soon after this, I went to board at the old Stan Nicholas, the then fashionable hotel. From that time I began to drift more and more away from home influences. Soon after the wine supper episode, I threw up my position, and Ed and I started on our own account under the name of Eweed & Co. My partner's parents were wealthy, and his father had been well known in the street, which fact gave us standing. The years I speak of were fortunate ones for Wall Street, stocks of every kind on the boom, the general wealth of the country massing up by leaps and bounds, and every kind of speculative enterprise being launched. Our firm history was the usual one of broker firms in that tumultuous arena, the Wall Street of those days. Commissions in plenty, a large income, but one's bank account never growing, for what was made by day in the wild excitement of shifting values was thrown away amid wilder scenes at night. Those too were indeed the flush times for the professional gambler, for men were not content unless they burned the candle at both ends. Day faro banks were open everywhere around the exchange, and enormous sums were nightly staked in the uptown games. These were everywhere, all protected, and the proprietors invested their money for rent, fixtures, and so on with as much confidence, and kept their doors open as freely, as if embarked in a legitimate speculation. Hundreds who spent the business hours of the day in the mad excitement of the exchange flocked around the green cloth at night, devoting the same intensity of thought and brain to the turning of a card which earlier in the day they had given to the market reports of the world. Small wonder that death cut such wide swaths in the army of brokers. Statistics show that it was more fatal to belong to that army than to an army in the field. Ed loved to have me with him, and I used to accompany him to a game, then quite famous, run by John Morrissey, who later became a member of Congress. At this time I never ventured a single bet and did not like to visit the place. but Ed would beg me to go and always promised faithfully not to remain more than 20 minutes. Of course, his 20 minutes would lengthen into hours. Frequently, I would take a chair into a corner and go to sleep until he left the game, that being almost any hour between midnight and morning. As usual, in such places, an elegant supper was served free at midnight. The proprietor was always rather attentive to me, and, to give him the credit due, seemed anxious that I should not play. At supper he always reserved the chair next to himself for me. One night, while standing beside the roulette wheel, no one was playing, and the dealer was idly whirling the ball. A sudden impulse seized me, and the ball then rolling, I pulled a $20 bill from my pocket and threw it down on the red, remarking, "I'll lose that to pay for my suppers." Unhappily, I won, and laughing, turned to the dealer and said, "Here, give me my money." I am done, and a moment later went out with my friend, fully determined never more to gamble. But, being in there the next night, I, of course, ventured again. Again I was so unfortunate as to win, and within a short time staked and lost or won nightly. But something worse than gambling was ahead of me, just at the very door. Chapter 3. A licensed pirate. We had latterly somewhat neglected business, our real business being at night, when we made the pursuit of pleasure hard work. Soon the finances of our firm not only ran low, but were on 3 several occasions exhausted, so that we not only had recourse to borrowing, but were barely saved from bankruptcy by liberal donations from Ed's parents. His father was a fine, jolly old gentleman, and took it quite a matter of course that it was his duty to help us off the rocks when we ran on them. My partner took everything easy, but I, having no indulgent parent behind me ever ready to draw a cheque, began to be uneasy over the financial situation. Strangely enough, however, it never occurred to me to cut down my personal expenses, and I continued living at the same extravagant rate as when money was plenty, dining and wining and being dined and wined. Just here, an important character, one destined to have an influence for evil on my future life, came upon the scene, and I will halt for a moment in my narrative to give some account of him. This man was James Irving, popularly known as Jimmy Irving, chief of the New York detective force, and a bad-hearted, worthless scamp he was. I was with several friends in the Fifth Avenue Hotel one cold January night when he came in, and one of our party, knowing him, introduced us. He was a man of medium height, rather heavy-set, blonde moustache, pleasant eyes, but with a weak mouth and chin, and a flushed face, telling a tale of dissipation. It was when Boss Tweed ruled supreme in New York, and the whole administration was honeycombed with corruption. Except under similar political conditions, could such a man attain to so responsible an office in a great city as that of chief of the detective force, a position which at that time invested him with all but autocratic power. An old rounder and barroom loafer, without one attribute of true manliness, and not possessed of any quality which would point him out as a fit man for the place. Nevertheless, when the position became vacant, his political pull caused his selection. From being a mere detective on the staff, he became chief. And truly, this meant something in those days. The great Civil War had but lately ended, and the country was still reeling from the mighty conflict. The flush times resultant from the enormous money issue of the government kept everything booming. The foundations of society were shaken, and vice no longer hid itself in the dark caves and dens of the great city. The Tenderloin, with its multifarious and wider-reaching influence for evil, was then created, and the police of the city reaped a royal revenue from its 1,000 dens of vice for their protection. To be captain of the Tenderloin precinct meant an extra weekly income of 1,000 at least. He had the lion's share, about an equal amount went to headquarters, to be divided between the chief of police and the gang, Irving being one of the half-dozen who had pull enough to get in the ring. The Tenderloin lieutenant, roundsman and sergeant came in for about $100, $50 and $25 a week, while the common patrolman got what blackmail he could on his own account from the unhappy women of the street. These were considered lawful game, and woe betide the poor unfortunate who refused to pay the tax. Too well she found it meant a violent arrest, accompanied with brutal treatment, a night in a filthy cell, and then to be dragged before the magistrate, who was some ward heeler, hand in glove with the police. The form of a trial and a speedy 6 months on the island from the lips of the judge followed. From Spring Street to 10th, Broadway was full of night games, faro, each and all paying large sums for protection. This money, however, did not all go to police headquarters, there being a host of parasites aside from the police. the shoulder-hitter politicians, each with his pull and each having a claim to his percentage. Most of the Broadway games were known as square games, but then there was the host of skin games in the Bowery, Chatham Square, Houston, Prince, and other streets. The 8th Ward and all Broadway were considered the lawful happy hunting grounds for headquarters detectives, and this by long prescription. Outside of that, they have no claim save only to a percentage from the tenderloin. But the protection money paid by the swindling games around Chatham Square, Bayard Street, and the whole length of the Bowery, by a sort of sacred prescription, belonged to the captains of those precincts, save only that part absorbed by the politicians of the district who had a pull. These usually were the aldermen and councilmen with their henchmen. But to return to my friend, Captain Jim Irving, who, before our party separated, had opened 3 bottles of wine. Before leaving, I had asked him to call on me at the St. Nicholas. The next day he came and invited me to take a drive with him to Fordham the following Sunday. On Sunday he appeared behind a fast trotting horse, and in every respect an elegant turnout. During our drive he casually remarked that he had paid $1,000 for the rig, and as his pay was some $2,000 per annum, I easily figured that his rig and diamond pin had cost him about a year's salary. It was a lovely morning, not cold but bracing, just the day for a ride. We started for Fordham, but changed our minds and drove to the High Bridge, through Harlem Lane and well out into Westchester County. Returning, we stopped at O'Brien's Hotel for dinner. We fared sumptuously the whole day through, our dinner being particularly fine, my companion paying for everything, and really it was all highly enjoyable. He had a vast fund of anecdote, and many strange stories of city life and adventure, which naturally would be expected from one in his position. Many of those we passed or met during the day were personally known to him, and some, both women as well as men, who were then clothed in purple and fine linen, had histories, and many had at some period of their lives looked on life from the seamy side, having passed through strange vicissitudes. Soon after dark we returned to my hotel, and after dinner, lighting our cigars, we started for police headquarters. There he attended to some routine business, having introduced me to 2 of his chief detectives. Many who read this will recognize the men, but in this narrative they will be known as Stanley and White. I will not further describe them now, as they will appear in the story from time to time. The reader will be able to judge what manner of men they were. For the next 8 weeks my life went on, much the same as usual. In our business we made some money, but by one unfortunate investment lost our entire capital, and what proved worse for me, my partner's health began to fail. Dissipation, late and heavy dinners and irregular hours began to break a not over-strong constitution. Consequently, one Saturday, he abruptly announced his intention of withdrawing from the partnership to take a trip to Europe. There was nothing to divide save the furniture in our office, which he presented to me. The following Wednesday he sailed with 2 members of his family. I saw him off, bidding him what proved to be a last farewell. I left the wharf feeling very lonely and miserable. It may be well to remark here that he died a year later in Italy, one more victim of a fast life, while I was spared, but took no warning from his fate. In truth, I was in the Primrose Way, which is ever found a most tormenting and unhappy thoroughfare. How I grieved all through the 20 years of captivity that I had not had the moral courage to start afresh upon a basis of truth, sobriety, and honourable endeavour. Instead of cutting down my expenses, I rather became more extravagant, fearing my companions would suspect I was pressed for money. How much more manly had I called them together and told them we must part company. Meeting Irving from time to time, he was most flattering in his attentions, while I was young enough and silly enough to be pleased with his notice. One evening about this time I met him while coming out of Wallack's Theatre. Shaking hands warmly, he invited me to supper at what was then known as Upper Delmonico's. After supper, walking to the St. Denis Hotel at Broadway in 11th Street, we found detectives Stanley and White. Here wine was ordered, and long after midnight we parted, they first having exacted a promise to dine with them the following night at Delmonico's, at the same time stating that they wished to make me a business proposition. The next evening, White came in and said we would dine at a restaurant at 6th Avenue and 31st Street, instead of at Delmonico's. Then he left me, upon my promise to be on hand. At 11 I arrived, and entering the restaurant was at once recognized by a waiter, evidently on the lookout, and ushered into a private room upstairs. Only White had arrived, but soon Irving and Stanley came, and supper was ordered. With such gentry as these, wine is always in order. Then they became confidential, and the conversation turned to the subject of making money. Very skillfully, they extracted the confession that I had none. When excited by the talk and the wine, I cried out, "By heaven, I want money!" Stanley grasped my hand and said, "Of course you do. A man's a fool without it." Irving interjected, "Are you going to do us a favor and make 10,000 for yourself?" "But how?" I gasped. "Go to Europe and negotiate some stolen bonds we have, will you? For 10,000 to become accessory to a crime." It was an appalling proposition, and I shrank from it with an aversion I could not conceal any more than he and his confederates could conceal their chagrin over the way I took it and over the fact that their secret had been imparted to another. More wine was ordered, and before we parted I had promised not only secrecy, but, worse still, I had also promised to consider the proposition and give my answer the following night. As my evil genius would have it, that very morning I had a visit in my office from the agent of my landlord, requesting arrears of rent, and from a tradesman whom I was owing, demanding immediate payment of an overdue bill. Pressed for money as I was, the 10,000 seemed a large sum and offered an easy way out of my difficulties. I shall never forget that day, nor how its slow minutes dragged during the mental struggle. Time after time, I said, what could I not do with 10,000? How vast the possibilities before me with that sum at my command. Then, after all, had not the owner of these bonds lost them forever? And why should not I have a share instead of letting these villain detectives keep all? And through all I kept saying to myself, this, of course, is only speculation. I will never do this thing. At last the stars came out, and I started for a long walk alone up Broadway to Fifth Avenue and into the park. Since that park was formed, few men have ever passed its walks in whose bosoms raged such a tumult as in mine. I was young, in love with pleasure, and poverty seemed a fearful thing. I kept saying, I cannot do this thing, and then I would add, how am I to keep up appearances, and how am I to pay my debts? Unhappily, I had taken an enemy into the citadel. In the misery of the struggle, I drank heavily. In my excitement, I exaggerated my poverty until it seemed impersonated and assumed the guise of an enemy threatening to enslave me. From 8 o'clock to 11 I paced that mall, and then left it to keep my appointment with Irving & Co., with one thought surging through my brain, and that was that I dared not be poor, the result being that before we parted, to their renewed question, "Will you do this for us?" "Of course I will," I cried, and my feet had slipped a good many steps further down the primrose way to death. Chapter 4. Fools stumbling on fortunes. The present generation has become tolerably familiar with defalcations and robberies involving enormous sums. Previous to 1861, they were comparatively unknown, the reason being that the currency of the country was strictly limited. There were absolutely no government bonds or currency, while the few bonds issued by corporations were not usually made payable to bearer, and, therefore, were not negotiable, and were of no use to the robber. But in 1861, to meet the expenses of the war, the state banks were taxed out of existence, and our present national currency system came into being. In addition to the enormous issue of greenbacks, bonds payable to bearer, amounting to hundreds of millions, were issued by the general government, by the individual states, counties, towns and cities, all becoming popular investments. Patriotism, and profit as well, led banks, corporations and individuals all over the world to invest surplus funds in bonds, those of the government being most popular of all. The various issues authorized by Act of Congress were known as 730s, 1040s, 520s, and so on, these terms denoting either the rate of interest or the period of years, dating from the first issue wherein it was optional with the government to redeem them. Everywhere, at home, in the theatres and public resorts, not less than on the exchange, were heard animated discussions about 730s and 1040s. The business of the express companies of the United States took a new phase, and for the first time in their history they began to be the carriers of vast sums from city to city. Then it was that those gentlemen who work without the pale of the law discovered new prospects of wealth, and realized that even to crack a safe or vault of a private firm would be rewarded by a find of bonds that might amply repay all risks of robbery under police protection, while to execute a successful raid on a car or even an express delivery wagon on the street would mean wealth. To burglarize the vaults of a bank meant, if undetected, anything from opening a magnificent bar or hotel in New York to a steam yacht and winter cruises in the tropics and summer nights on the Mediterranean. The first coup in this line, which at once became famous, was startling in its ease and magnitude. It was known, and still is, as the Lord Bond robbery. Lord was a very wealthy man who had inherited his millions. His office was in Broad Street, where he managed his estates. He had invested $1,200,000 in 730 bonds, all payable to bearer. For the thief, if he had any knowledge of finance and knew how to negotiate them, such a sum as this in bonds was better than the same amount in gold, it being more portable. $1,200,000 in gold would weigh upward of a ton and would be difficult to handle, but that sum in bonds would hardly fill a carpet sack. In our day, with safety deposit vaults everywhere, it seems strange that any sane man would keep so vast a sum in an old-fashioned vault in his private office. But Lord did so. His office was a very quiet one, with but few visitors, there being no business transacted in it but that of his estate. At this time there were 3 or 4 gangs in New York, all well known and friendly with the police. That is, some or all were more or less under protection, and had pulls at police headquarters. But the pull could not be depended upon at all times, particularly if the robbery made a noise and the press took it up. Then there would be violent kicks at headquarters, and a general all-around scramble to get the thieves, and so far as safe, stick to more or less of the plunder. The gang that got Mr. Lord's bonds was what in police and thieves' slang was known as on the office, so named because they went around visiting offices in the business part of the city, one of the gang going in on pretense of making some inquiry and so engaging the attention of one of the clerks. Then the second member would come in and endeavour to attract the attention of any remaining clerks, while the third would try to get in without attracting attention, and, if unnoticed by those now busy talking, would slip around behind the counter to the money drawer or vault and carry off any cash box or package visible which appeared to be of value. This gang consisted of 3 men, Hod Ennis, Charlie Rose, and a man by the name of Bullard, afterward made notorious by engineering the Boylston Bank robbery in Boston. In the absence of Lord, the office was under charge of 2 men, old-fashioned fellows, who had grown grey in the service of the Lord estate. The bonds were all in a tin box, something larger than a soap box. The interest on the bonds being due, the box had been taken out in order to cut off the coupons, and was left in the door of the open vault. None of these circumstances was known to these men. In fact, while looking for chances, they stumbled on the prize. The night previous they had spent at a well-known faro game and had lost their last dollar. At 9 o'clock in the morning they met at a saloon on Prince Street, where none but crooks consorted, and, borrowing $1 from the barkeeper, they took a South Ferry stage and started downtown on one of many similar piratical expeditions. Of course, each paid his own fare, as from the moment of starting until their return they appeared to be strangers. Alighting at the ferry, they started up Front Street, Rose in lead, he being pilot fish. From Front, they turned into Broad and up Broad to number 22, where there were a number of offices. Rose mounted the staircase, it now being 5 minutes to 10, Bullard coming close behind. Rose entered the first office to the left at the head of the stairs, which was Lord's, and at once inquired by name for a member of a well-known firm located a few doors down across the street. Lord was away. The clerk, in his desire to serve the gentleman, went to the front windows to point out the location of the firm. Bullard, who had lingered in the hall, entered, leaving the office door open behind him, and at once engaged the attention of the remaining clerk with a letter. Ennis, seeing the coast clear, slipped in, went softly to the vault, and perceiving the tin box, seized and carried it out, unseen by all save his companions. They, seeing him safely off, found a quick pretext to follow without any suspicion arising in the minds of the clerks. As a matter of fact, they did not miss the box for nearly an hour. Ennis carried it to Peckslip, closely followed by his chums, and there the 3 boarded a Second Avenue car, all unsuspecting as to what a prize they had. At the corner of the Bowery and Bayard Street, they got out and entered that old red brick hotel on the corner, I forget the name. They were acquainted, and occasionally rendezvoused there, hiring and paying for the room. They speedily opened the box, and were amazed to find it packed full of bonds. 500s, thousands, 5,000s, all payable to bearer. The very magnitude of their plunder terrified them, and, knowing as much as I do about such men, I am free to affirm that if a buyer of stolen property had appeared on the scene and said, "Here, I'll give you 10,000 apiece," they would have closed the deal at once and turned over the bonds, glad to get them off their hands. What they did was this. Rose went out and bought a second-hand carpet bag and put the bonds into it, save 6,500s, which they divided, and Bullard resolved to leave the bag with a friend of his. This friend, strangely enough, was the widow of a policeman and sister of 2 others. But she knew nothing of Bullard's character, believing him to be a working man. Ennis and Rose were 2 ignorant fellows, without the remotest idea of how to negotiate bonds. But Bullard had, and, realizing how important it was to get some cash before the thing was noised around, he started out to sell some, agreeing to meet Rose and Ennis at No. 103rd Avenue, a large beer saloon then, as now. Going to different brokers' offices, he disposed of 10 for 5,000 without any difficulty, and stopped at that. He met his 2 friends and divided the 5,000 with them. Then, as a natural consequence with that class of men, all got drunk, and before the next morning had spent, loaned or gambled away every dollar of the 5,000. I remember perfectly the tremendous sensation created when a rumor of the robbery spread in Wall Street and over the city, and what mystified and intensified the matter was the fact that no complaint had been made to the police. When Mr. Lord was interviewed by them and by reporters, he would not admit that he had been robbed, and said if he had been, he would prefer to lose the money rather than have a fuss made about the affair. This was really the first of many great bond robberies, and it struck the popular fancy. But if it stirred Wall Street greatly, who shall describe the frenzy of excitement that broke out at 300 Mulberry Street, police headquarters, when the first vague rumours of a gigantic robbery were fully confirmed, and it became known that Hod Ennis and his gang had $1 million and more of plunder. All rings and pulls and gangs were smashed, combined, and recombined again, while each and all were in an agony of fear lest the booty should be returned to the owner, minus a percentage divided between the gang and the ring, or sold to some clever fence, who would plant them away safely and sell them in Europe from time to time, keeping all for himself and they to have no share. What visions of diamond pins, of 8 or 12 carats, all Brazilian stones, of swift, high-stepping horses, of the heaven of Harlem Lane on Sunday afternoons, with a bottle or 2 under the vest, haunted the sleep of all the detective force. I say the police knew Hod Ennis, and his gang had stolen the bonds, for in those days there was not a gang of confidence, men, card sharpers, bank burglars, counterfeiters or forgers travelling the country, but that the gang and every member of it was well known to the police department of each of our large cities. Whenever a job was done, a score of detectives all over the country could say such and such a gang did the job, and they were almost always right. Whether there was something in for the force to arrest and convict or not, as a matter of fact the thieves were sooner or later hocus-pocused out of their share, either by the police, by some untrustworthy fence, or by some lawyer who was pitched upon to work back the securities on a percentage. In case the thief succeeded in saving part of the proceeds, he immediately lost it at faro or in revelry, and then risked his liberty for more. I know 2 men who today walk the streets of New York, the types of conservative respectability, members of many fashionable clubs who, in the 60s, were known as fences and were always ready to invest cash for stolen bonds. Both of these men compromised with their conscience by beating down the price and giving the thieves but a moiety of their value. Both of them have their fads. One is a connoisseur in violins, the other has a penchant for orchids and has much local fame for the rarities in his collection. Before midnight of the day of the robbery, it became known to the force and many of the hangers on of the gambling saloons and bar-rooms of the 8th Ward that Hod Ennis and his gang had money, and it was surmised that it must be from the Lord business. In the meantime, Bullard took the bag of bonds up to Norwalk, Cotte, and placed them for safekeeping, with a trusty friend, first taking out 100 bonds of 500 each and 50 of 1,000 each, and, returning to the city, divided them with his comrades. During his absence, the photographs of the 3 men had been shown at police headquarters to the 2 clerks, but they were unable to identify them. Within the next few days, the 100,000 in bonds were completely dissipated. Some were sold to buyers as stolen goods for a percentage of the value. Some were lost at the gambling games, mostly at Morrissey's or at Mike Murray's on Broadway, near Spring Street, and probably some went Mulberry Street way. Matters were thickening, and fearing arrest, Ennis fled to Canada, Bullard to Europe, and Rose went west to California. Eventually Ennis was convicted of a crime committed some time before. He was sentenced to a long imprisonment, and came out an old, broken-down man, without a dollar and without a friend. Rose was sentenced to 5 years for another crime and then disappeared. Bullard settled down in Paris. He afterward returned and planned the Boylston Bank affair in Boston. With his share of the plunder, he went back to Paris and opened an American bar at the Grand Hotel and flourished for some years, but, wanting money, he committed a robbery in Belgium, was arrested, and is now serving a long sentence for the same, no doubt. If he survives, he will emerge friendless, penniless, a stranger in a strange world. If I were inclined to indulge in reminiscences, what a catalogue could be given of men who had, like myself, drifted into the primrose way, and all, or nearly all, have paid a terrible penalty for their wrongdoing, none more terrible than myself. As for our violin virtuoso, he seems to have conquered fate. So, too, with the connoisseur in orchids, but let us wait until the end before we say all is well with them. Some time later on, meeting one of these detectives, now dead, who then ranked as the best in New York, in the confidence of the bankers, he said, "I am getting old, and am now working for reputation, and consequently am not taking any more percentages. Of course, I don't molest any of my old friends, but those who are not under protection, I run in and send them up the river, Sing Sing, as fast as I get them to rights." This need not be considered a condemnation of all detectives, for there were, even in my time, a few honest ones of the Pinkerton and John Curtin class, the latter being now one of San Francisco's most reliable, who, by unusually considerate judgment, has made honourable citizens of a very large number of clerks whom he had been called upon to detect and arrest. This he accomplished by extracting a confession in writing, filing it among his secret papers, then saying to the trembling clerk, "I shall have you reinstated in your position, but if you go wrong again this confession will be made public." The following incident will further enlighten the reader as to the way things were done in those good old days, when Boss Tweed was in the full zenith of his power and glory, and of the wealth so easily acquired by certain methods. His daughter was married. All of the then chiefs and district officers of Tammany, city officials, judges and heads of departments vied with each other in the presentation of wedding gifts, among which was a cheque for 100,000 from the father. Seldom has any bride received a more magnificent tribute, for, coming from such sources, they were nothing less than a tribute. Especially was this the case with one much admired gift, which was contributed by us just after an illicit operation of 40,000 in Wall Street, 4,000 of which was paid to Irving. In the column list of wedding gifts in the next morning's papers was one solid silver punch bowl, value 500, presented by Superintendent Kelso. Shortly after paying Irving the 4,000 percentage, we met him one evening at the St. Cloud Hotel. Mentioning the approaching Tweed marriage, he suggested that it would be the thing, and make us more solid with the Superintendent of Police, for us to make a fine present to the old man, one that he could use as a gift to the bride. As 500 was not much to our party in those days, we assented and handed over that amount. Tiffany's was then located down Broadway, and among other things on exhibition in the window was a large, handsome silver punch bowl. This was purchased with our money, which was known to have been obtained by forgery, and presented to Superintendent Kelso. A few days later the bowl reappeared in the window of Tiffany's, thus inscribed, "Suz, prize, tormented, our..." Alpha Na, presented by Time James Kelso. Alpha Na, Superintendent of Police. May loyalty and love know no end. No end, plus, no end. Chapter 5. WHEN, Tweed WASN, EWY, OYOS, Owner AN, DJIM, FISK, Proprietor OFOUR Judges. What a look of relief and triumph swept over the faces of Irving, Stanley, and White when I gave my consent to their proposal to take the stolen bonds to Europe and negotiate them there. We understood each other now, and casting aside all reserve, their tongues wagged freely, and they eagerly told me how confident they were of my ability to dispose of the bonds successfully, and also of my good faith, and, furthermore, told me I was the only man they would have trusted. Of course, they had no security save my word, for under the circumstances they could hardly ask me for a receipt, and even had I given one, it would have been valueless had I chosen to retain the proceeds of the bonds. Thus, becoming the important member of the firm, I told them to produce the securities and I would sail immediately. It was finally settled that I should go by the steamer Russia of the Cunard Line, which was down for sailing at 7 a.m. Wednesday, and they were to deliver the bonds to me on Tuesday night. Upon my demanding cash to pay expenses, their faces fell, but quickly brightened when I told them to give me $1,000 bond, and I would borrow that amount from a friend, using it for security. There was no danger of the number of the bond being inspected, and of course I would pay the note upon my return and receive the bond again. They told me many amusing lies as to how the securities came into their possession, and as to who were the rightful owners. The truth was, as I afterward learned, they were a part of the stolen Lord bonds. Bonds issued by our government and held in Europe, chiefly in Holland and Germany, were so enormous in volume and passed so freely from hand to hand that it was easy for a well-dressed, business-appearing man to sell any quantity, even if stolen, as by law, the innocent holder could not be deprived of them. One great advantage a dishonest man had at that date in Europe, especially an American, was that if he dressed well they considered he must be a gentleman, and if he had money that was a proof of respectability, one they never thought of questioning, nor how he came by it, then, again, it was an article of their creed that all Americans are rich. The next morning, Tuesday, Irving met me near the exchange, and, with some trepidation, drew from an inner pocket an envelope containing the $1,000 bond. Without waiting to examine it, I walked off, saying, "I'll be back in 10 minutes." He was evidently alarmed, and, like all rogues, suspicious of everyone. He probably had some wild idea that I was laying a trap for him. In his ignorance of money methods, he thought it would be a long, perhaps difficult, negotiation to borrow money on the bond, but of course I made short work of it, and Jimmy was more than delighted when within the 10 minutes I walked in with 10 100s in my hand. A trifle like this made a great impression upon Irving, and from that time on I had his entire confidence. Tuesday evening, I said goodbye to my mother, merely remarking in explanation of my journey that I had a commission given me to execute in Europe. Leaving her, I went to our rendezvous near Broadway and Astor Place, where I found Irving, who handed me over his boodle, as he termed it, remarking confidentially that I was to give him on my return his share into his own hands, and, singularly enough, each of the others did precisely the same thing. About 11 o'clock the other two came in, and after some parley White handed over his bonds, and Stanley informed me he would give me his on board before the steamer sailed the next morning. I had already paid my bill and sent my baggage over to Jersey City, so about midnight I set out, they accompanying me as far as the ferry, and there, after shaking hands a half-dozen times, we said goodbye. Having bought my ticket and engaged my cabin, I went direct to the steamer and went to bed. In the morning Stanley appeared and gave me his bonds. 10 minutes later, the hawsers were cast off and we were steaming down the bay. 2 hours later, Fire Island sank beneath the horizon and we were alone on the sea. Alone on the sea, and a fitting place to tell the story of a famous New York bank robbery. In the good old days when Bill Tweed was New York's owner, when Jim Fisk was the proprietor of our judges and Kelso sat in Mulberry Street, the king of those good men, the police who defend our lives and property, this city became a spectacle to gods and men such as we thought then could never be equalled. We thought so then, but we were not endowed with second sight, nor with the gift of prophecy, or we might perhaps have reserved our judgment. Still, our masters were a unique collection, and if they have been equalled or surpassed since, they held with easy grasp the preeminence among all American rulers who had shone and flourished up to the time when those great men gave us new ideas upon the science of government. The average and quiet citizen, shocked as he might be, and grumble as he did at the impudent plundering by our masters, their contempt of public opinion, and the cynical display of their luxury, would doubtless have confined himself to grumbling, and to calling for slow-arriving thunderbolts to crush the oppressors who were despoiling him, had he felt certain that the plunder would be confined to them, that his property would be safe, at least. from the attacks of those insignificant, despicable, but eminently dangerous plunderers who became known to the police as common criminals. This, however, was not so. After being flayed by iniquitous taxes, which he knew were destined to add to the stores of Tweed, Connolly and Company, he had every day abundant proof that what the big rascals left him, the little ones would soon try, by burglary or robbery, to ravish from him, and that they would do it with perfect immunity, unterrified either by the fear of present arrest or of later punishment. The Mulberry Street office was divided into 3 or 4 little pools, each with its clientele of dependents, all of whom faithfully and immediately reported to their patrons the result of any little job they had been engaged in, handing over to the representative of the pool the 20% of the result, which was headquarters' established commission. This was the ordinary rate when gentlemen skilled in transferring other people's watches and portmonnaies from the pockets of their owners to their own, or when others who had devoted their talents to demonstrating practically the enormous power of the jimmy and wedge originated and carried out by themselves the operations peculiar to those classes of industries. It sometimes happened that special cases offered, for which special terms were arranged. Such cases stood by themselves. They were confided only to the acknowledged heads of the profession. Standing outside of all recognized rules, they were treated apart. Headquarters men were always sent to the seat of operations to prevent interference, and, in case of need, to protect their partners. Many a mysterious robbery was perpetrated to which no clue was ever found. Many an anxious search was undertaken by the bloodhounds of the law to find the robbers, that they might crack a bottle together and rejoice over the success of their operations, and sometimes they were joined by men the mention of whose names in such company would have excited incredulous and unbounded amazement. The gigantic heavings of the war were struggling to rest, but the men whose minds were unhinged and thrown off their balance by the possession of large sums flowing from transactions, a little irregular perhaps, but which the necessities of government permitted, were endeavouring by any means to open up new fountains of wealth in place of those which the close of the war had exhausted. One of the resources presenting itself most naturally to men in a position to profit by it was speculating with other people's money, and very naturally the result of such speculation was disastrous in the highest degree. When detection became inevitable, the defaulter generally fled, hoping to find in a foreign land safety from the stroke of justice and a shelter from the reproaches of his victims. Occasionally, one more resolute, dreading flight as much as detection, flung himself into schemes which, if they failed, meant the most hideous and utter ruin, but which, if they succeeded, rendered discovery impossible and made his position more solid than ever before. One day, late in the 60s, in the parlour of a bank in Greenwich Street, a gentleman was anxiously scanning the books of the establishment. He alone in all the institution knew of a secret which would horrify his brother officials and carry desolation to scores of homes, the first to suffer being his own. Perhaps had it been possible to exempt this one home, the misery of the others would not have greatly affected him, but suffering must be kept from his own house, and all and any means to banish it would be and must be good. The gentleman in whose mind these thoughts were passing was the president of the bank, who knew himself to be a defaulter to an enormous amount, and who was now anxiously reflecting upon the means to cover up his robberies. Fortunately for him, he was acquainted with the one man who more than any other in all America was able to help him. This was Captain Irving. The president was a man of nerve. He knew, as everybody else knew, the relations in which the police stood to the thieves, and he felt that if he could arrange to have his own bank robbed, his difficulties would vanish and his share in the defalcations be covered up. Little time was left to him before the inevitable discovery, but the prompt and skilful use he made of it to extricate himself from the fearful danger of his position makes one almost regret that a man of such resolution and such opportunities should prove to the world that high qualities may exist when the moral sense is entirely wanting. Irving was quickly taken into his confidence, the position explained, the proposition to rob the bank broached, all possible cooperation in the way of leaving safes unlocked and doors open, or what, of course, amounts to the same thing, of furnishing keys and information to open everything, promised, and then Irving was asked if he could find men to carry the job into execution. New York in those days was well supplied with such artists, but the right men to carry out so momentous an operation had to be sought. The difficulty, however, was not great, and Irving promptly assured the honourable president that he might confidently count on the right men at the right time. Among the professionals who 23 or 4 years ago were considered valuable men at police headquarters were Mike Hurley, Patsy Conroy, and Max Shinburn. These were the men whom Irving instantly determined to employ, and whom he forthwith set about to find. That not being a matter of any difficulty, the same night the three men met Irving at his own house and were delighted over the revelation he made to them. One would like to know with what sentiment a man occupying an honorable and responsible position, a Sunday school superintendent, the head of a great financial institution, well known in the money world and respected in society, slunk to a midnight meeting with burglars. Did no feeling of shame crimson his face, no sinking of disgust oppress his heart, as he slipped into a house where, although he kept aloof from actual contact with the ruffians, the details of an enormous crime of which he was the author were debated and settled. Prudential reasons doubtless kept him from forming a personal acquaintance with his agents. The risk of exposing himself to future blackmail must not be incurred, and one may well believe that he shrank from clasping the hands of these men who were eagerly awaiting him. Whatever were his feelings, his desperate position suffered no halting. The storm was ready to break at any moment. In an instant he might be a wretched fugitive, with terror before him and infamy howling behind. But one way led out of this labyrinth. He had resolutely planted his feet in that way, determined to tread it to the end. He did tread it to the end, and he came out victorious. If the suspicions of any afterward pointed toward him, no syllable of the suspicions was breathed. Who dared suspect that an honorable citizen had ever, in the dead of night, crept like a robber to a meeting of outlaws to concoct the details of an outrageous breach of trust, of a crime which, none knew it better than he, would carry lifelong misery and suffering to the families of nearly every man who trusted him? The evil that men do lives after them, but where does the responsibility of its author end? Who will ever say what crimes may spring from the one act of wrongdoing, crimes committed, it may be, by persons who were directly led into them by the consequences of an act, the perpetrator of which had never heard of those affected by it? How far does the responsibility of the wrongdoer extend? What weight of horror is he accumulating on his head? Such questions may perhaps occur afterward, when the pleasure has been tasted and is gone, and nothing remains of the detected crime but the ruin it has wrought. But in the excitement of laying the plot, in the glamour which the hope of success casts over the schemer, they probably never intrude, conscience is smothered, and he is left to carry out his schemes to the end. Doubtless no such thoughts disturbed the president as he waited that night while Irving acted as go-between, carrying messages from him to the agents and from the agents back again to him. At last the arrangements were made. Duplicate keys of the safe were to be provided, and a way, to be presently explained, was to be left open to each of them. Whatever the robbers found in the safes was to be theirs, and the task of getting it was to be of the easiest. This, of course, was highly satisfactory to the thieves, but something more must be prepared for the stockholders and the public. Bank safes are not so easily emptied. There must be the appearance, at least, of great effort to effect the robbery, and marks of the effort must be left behind. It was, therefore, settled that powerful tools were to be provided, tools able to tear open any strong box in the world. Such articles are expensive, and the burglars had no money to procure them. No man who knows those people will be surprised at this, for, however much money they may obtain, they never have anything. It melts out of their hands, and they would be themselves embarrassed to say what becomes of it. The president's first necessity, therefore, was to pay out about $1,000 for the jimmies, wedges, and all the paraphernalia of the burglar's industry. This he did. Irving took charge of the money, and he had far too great an interest in the scheme to suffer the cash to be squandered. The agreement was that on the following day Conroy should present himself at the bank to hire a vacant basement, the roof of which formed the floor of the room where the safes were lodged. The president undertook to smooth any difficulties in the way of requiring references, and promised that he should be accepted as a tenant. This agreement was punctually carried out. Conroy made his application. The basement was granted to him, the rent paid in advance for the edification of the clerks, and he at once entered in possession. Hurley and Shinburn joined him, and the following Saturday they removed so much of the ceiling that but a few minutes' work was required to complete a hole which should serve as a doorway to the vaults above when the bank closed in the evening. Chapter 6. Cheated visions, A.N.D. vanished hopes. Saturday night was the time chosen to get into the bank, and the plunderers were to remain there until Sunday. The members of Irving's ring were to keep watch to prevent any officious interference from passers by or from ward policemen. Carriages were to be in waiting at some convenient place on Sunday morning, and when the men inside received a signal from their police accomplices on the outside, they were to leave the bank abandoning their tools and carrying away nothing but the money and the securities they had stolen. So far, the way was plain. The keys had long before been prepared, tested, and found to work properly. Full instructions were given as to the way to use them, but the way inside was not yet open. A night watchman was employed on the premises, and he, of course, was to be got rid of. Little ceremony was to be used in treating him. He was to be seized, overcome by any means, bound, gagged, and rendered helpless until Monday, and the fact that he always passed Sunday in the bank prevented any remark at home upon his continued absence. The details of the plot were thus satisfactorily settled, and at a late hour the conspirators separated. In the early morning of that day, the 3 burglars were standing in the cellar, to which they had lowered their booty, waiting for the signal to come out. At last it was given, when the precious trio slipped out, carrying their precious bags. A covered carriage was posted in an adjoining street, into which the whole party entered, flurried and excited, and rapidly drove to Irving's residence. There the contents of the bags were carefully examined. The actual cash was easily disposed of, but what was to be done with the bonds? The arrangement finally agreed upon, to be detailed presently, shows that if there be circumstances in which a little learning is a dangerous thing, one of them is not just after the perpetration of a gigantic burglary. The Monday following its execution, confusion and amazement reigned in the bank. The clerks on their arrival were astounded to find the safe doors wide open, torn and smashed by the tools which lay scattered over the floor, and the night watchman, gagged and bound, was discovered, nearly dead, in a neighbouring room. One of the clerks jumped into a cab and rushed to police headquarters in Mulberry Street to report the robbery. Irving was sitting in his office, busy with the night reports, when the messenger was introduced to tell of the bank's calamity. The excellent chief listened with breathless attention and was naturally horror-struck at the perpetration of such a crime. Calling a couple of his trusted sleuths, he hastily communicated the surprising news, and the 3 hurried with the clerk back to Greenwich Street. Arrived there, they minutely examined the premises, and gave it as their opinion, judging from the style of the work and from the tools which lay around, that the burglary had been committed by a well-known burglar named Harry Penrose, and that the night watchman, whom they immediately placed under arrest, must have been his accomplice. The president had sent word to the bank that he was unwell, and would not be able to attend to business that day, but the terrible news was immediately telegraphed to him, and, in spite of his illness, he hurried to town. It is impossible to describe his astonishment and distress at the sight which met his eyes. In the presence of the clerks he held anxious consultations with the detectives, who assured him that they had already taken the first steps to unravel the mystery, and that every possible effort would be made to discover the criminals. In the privacy of his own office he explained to the reporters that he had left in the bank $400,000 in cash and bonds, every farthing of which had disappeared. As soon as the news was published, the excitement among the depositors and the stockholders of the bank was, of course, immense. A run set in, which the directors, by the help of friends and of their own private resources, were able to meet. But the Wall Street appreciation of the calamity was shown in the drop in value of the bank's stock from 130 to 40. I repeat, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Much knowledge is not to be looked for among men who engage in such crimes, but one would fancy that the everyday experience of Irving and his people would have given them some idea of financial business. The fact is, they were, if possible, more ignorant than their felonious partners. The financial ideas of the latter scarcely went further than making cheap pennyworths of their plunder, giving to courtesans and living like lords till all be gone, so that negotiating the sale of bonds was a mystery far too high for them, something which they could never hope to attain to. But the company included one man who was a rare exception to the ordinary ride of such society. This was Max Shinburn, a German, a man of considerable education, who, in some inexplicable way, had fallen so far from honour and respectability that when he saw a thief he consented unto him. How is it that such men are often found in the ranks of professional criminals? They would probably have difficulty to explain it themselves. A want of savoir-faire, the fact that they have never been taught to make a practical use of their acquirements, the pressure of temptation at a critical moment, the absence, possibly, from harm, leading to the hope of immunity. All, perhaps, enter into the explanation of the secret promptings which have led to the first false step, to the first planting of the feet in the path which leads to destruction. Once the step is taken, to retrace it seems impossible. The line which society draws, and which it proclaims no man shall overstep without punishment, may be approached very closely. But once on the wrong side, once the fateful step is taken, the act is irretrievable, To attempt to retrace it is to attempt to undo the past. It is all but impossible. Thus probably it is that the fall of an educated man is more hopeless than that of one who knows no better. A carpenter or a blacksmith who has got himself in a tangle has only to move to another town, and if he shakes off perverted thoughts and perverted influences, he is not much worse off than before. He has kept his trade, and his trade will keep him. Nobody is going to inquire about a workman who can do his work. The employer requires nothing more than that the work be done, and if it be done, he neither thinks nor cares anything more about either it or the worker. With the educated man, the case is different. The sentiments of the class he belongs to are less yielding, the fineness of his own feelings has been too deeply wounded, and when he has stabbed his reputation, he is apt, foolishly of course, to fling the rest of his respectability after it. With qualities and advantages which might have fitted him for a useful and honourable position in life, Shinburn was at less than 30 years of age the companion of outcasts. But whatever his moral failings, his knowledge remained, and it was for him, at least, to be valuable. To get rid of the bonds in America was impossible, except by sacrificing them to a stolen goods receiver, who would have given but a small percentage of their value. A steamer was to sail for Europe that day, and it was agreed that Shinburn should go by her, with one of the other robbers as company, sell the bonds before the news of the robbery could get across the ocean, then return and fairly divide the proceeds. This was the arrangement, but Shinburn had already begun to have other dreams and other ambitions. He saw a chance to restore himself, or at least to snatch at a position which would give him weight to crush down sinister reports or envious whisperings, and he determined forthwith to seize it. What the bank president had done to save himself from infamy, Shinburn would do to recover himself from infamy. It can be therefore easily understood that he accepted without hesitation the other's proposal. The steamer did not sail until noon. There was therefore plenty of time to make preparations, and, besides, he had a little private business to attend to. Leaving the securities in Irving's charge, with a promise to meet the party at 11, he took his share of the cash and departed. Some time before this, with a skill and forethought rarely to be found in the class he then belonged to, he had bought some building lots near the park. Fortunate indeed the speculation eventually proved to be. In the meantime, placing his lots in the hands of a responsible agent and taking drafts on Europe for his money, he rapidly made the little preparation he needed, and at 11 joined his party, there to receive nearly 200,000 in bonds and to set out with Mike Hurley for the steamer. After hurried parting injunctions from the headquarters, men, the two travellers, accompanied by Conroy to see them off, were rapidly driven to the steamer. Punctually to the hour, the hawsers were cast off, and with barely time to say goodbye, the cronies parted. A moment after the screw began to turn, and the Cunarder's bow pointed toward England. Arrived in Liverpool, the pair proceeded at once to London. Hurley, who was as ignorant of foreign travel as of everything else, was easily tricked by some tale of no evening trains for the continent. Shinburn plied him well with liquor, taking care to mix the bottles, and when he had got him helplessly drunk, he took the bonds and with his little luggage slipped quietly off to the continent, never to see his dupe or his New York friends again. He went to Germany, called himself Count Shinburn, bought an estate, and began to exercise large hospitality toward his neighbours. No man on all the length of the Rhine was so popular as he. No man's house and table, horses and gardens were so praised as his. In the eyes of the beggar nobles of the fatherland, the man who could give such dinners and in such succession must belong to the choice members of the human race. Day by day, Max's position grew more solid. No breath was ever whispered against him, and with a little prudence he might have kept up his state and died in the odour of sanctity. But the taste of grandeur was too sweet, the incense of his little world's flattery, too precious to run the smallest risk of losing it. His display exceeded his means, but for nothing in the world would he have curtailed it. Matters were in this way until he awoke one day to find his account overdrawn on his bankers. Then it was that he began to remember his operation in Greenwich Street, and he seems to have thought that if he succeeded in New York, surely nothing could stand in his way in some sleepy town in Europe. He went to Brussels prospecting, and soon pitched upon an establishment which he thought likely to reward his industry. But the result showed that to walk into a bank when the way was left open, with the authorities anxious to see him there, and to force his way in when the entrance was jealously barred with the guardians determined he should stay out, were two very different things. He made the attempt, was arrested, and sentenced to 16 years' imprisonment. His German friends heard of his mishap, and his glory faded like the early dew. Naturally, everyone thought that the Count's career had closed, that the star of his fate had declined, that the bars of his prison house were about him forever. They were greatly mistaken. After some 12 or 13 years, he succeeded in getting a pardon and managed to make his way to America. His first visit was to the agents in whose hands he had left the management of his park lots. He went into their office, not knowing whether or not he was a pauper. He came out knowing himself to be nearly a millionaire. During the almost 20 years of his absence, his lots had increased enormously in value. Once more he was a rich man. Once more he might emerge from his eclipse and become a power of a certain kind in the class of society he could get access to. But his experience had taught him something. His advancing years had left him but little desire for display. He came back to a world which knew him not, and few of those who notice a benevolent-looking old gentleman, who often passes an afternoon in Upper Broadway, suspect that under an assumed name he hides the identity of Max Shinburn, the bank burglar. When Hurley awoke from his drunken fit in London and recognized that his partner had both robbed and deserted him, he felt that his mission was over, and that nothing remained but to return at once to America. Loud and long and wrathful were the complaints over Shinburn's treachery. Whatever he did to others, all felt that his dealings with them ought to have been on the square. But there was no help for it. He had disappeared, and faint, indeed, was the chance that they would ever see him again. The success of the crime, so far as they were concerned, had, after all, been a failure. Vanished hopes and cheated visions were their share, instead of the wealth they had anticipated, and in their devouring rage they tried to console themselves with the thought of what they would do to him if they ever met Shinburn. The only man who had any real success from the scheme was the president. Exposure had become impossible. He had taken good care not to leave too much in the safes for his accomplices, and he was henceforth a wealthy man. The bank, desperately shaken by the robbery, fell so greatly in the esteem of the public that not long after it failed. The president gave up banking and began to speculate in real estate. He increased in riches and prospered in the world. He called his lands after his own name. He thought his house would continue forever, and men praised him because he did well to himself. He settled his children comfortably in life, and when he died, not so very long ago, all felt that the world was better because he had lived in it, and that, although their loss when he was taken was heavy, it was, nevertheless, his great gain. Chapter 7. Gilded, SIR, wise. After a pleasant voyage, the Russia arrived, and one May morning I walked into the Northwestern Railway Station in Liverpool to take the train for London. The bonds were in a little handbag, and I was free to look around. Everything was novel and strange, and all things told me I was in a foreign land. I had, like most young people, a particularly good opinion of myself and something of an idea as to my own importance. We arrived in London amid a drizzling rain, and I was much impressed with the mighty roar of the traffic in the streets. We drove to Langham Place, where I had a regular English tea, and liked it immensely too. The next night, I left Victoria Station for Dover, and crossing the Channel to Ostend, went through to Brussels and stopped there, having wanted, ever since boyhood, to visit the field of Waterloo. I looked through the city that day, visiting the famous City Hall and one of the art galleries. Retiring early, I arose early and drove out to the plain immortalized by the giant struggle of those valiant hosts, but did not purchase any of the relics which were freely offered. These have been sold by shiploads to 2 generations of visitors. Returning to Brussels, I paid my bill at the Hôtel de Paris and was amused over the inventiveness of the proprietor in making charges, towels, candles, soap, attendants, paper, envelopes being among them. Going to the station, I bought my ticket for Frankfurt. That old town I was destined to see so much of during the next few years. On my journey, I would pass through Cologne, and from there the railway skirts the bank of the Rhine. This being my first visit to Europe, I was intensely curious to see everything, especially the cathedral at Cologne, and was eager to linger a few days along the banks of the Rhine. But I was more eager to complete the bond negotiations, and wisely resolved to go direct to Frankfurt, sell the bonds, then, with the money in my pocket and all anxiety over, I would be in a state of mind to enjoy a short holiday. I travelled through Belgium and some parts of Germany by daylight, and was, as most Americans are who travel on the continent, shocked to see the employment of women. Soon after leaving Brussels, I saw the, to me, novel sight of a number of women shoveling coal, handling the shovel like men. In other places, I saw them labouring in the brick yards, digging and wheeling clay, and everywhere they were to be seen working at men's work in the fields. A traveller in my compartment proved a most entertaining companion. He described himself to me as one who went about pottering over a lot of antiquities and fooling around generally. But my friend, the pottering old antiquary, gave me something of a surprise. At Chalours, all of our fellow travellers in the compartment left us. 2 of them were voluble French women, and they kept it up with amazing energy for the 6 hours from Brussels to Chalours. At every unusual swaying of the car, there would be a volley of "Mon Dieu!" and ear-piercing exclamations, and it was certainly a relief when they left. Bringing out a box of cigars, and my companion producing a flask of wine, we soon became confidential. Presently, to my great amusement, my old antiquary, warmed by the wine, confided to me that he was a detective police officer and chief of the Secret Service at Antwerp, that he was then working on a famous case and had been shadowing one of the ladies who had journeyed with us from Brussels. Before leaving Brussels, he had discovered his quarry was to quit the train, and as he had to go on to Mayence, he had turned the business over to a confederate. I was young, and no doubt he thought me innocent. Certainly he did not withhold his confidence. This is the case he was investigating. There was a wealthy gentleman by the name of Van Tromp living in Antwerp, a widower, 70 years of age, the father of a grown-up family, and many times a grandfather. It had been his custom to go to Baden-Baden every summer, spending money freely, both in pleasure and in the famous gambling resorts there. The last time he had met a woman, the Countess Windsorode, one of the many adventuresses to be found there, and speedily became infatuated. This Van Tromp was a descendant of old Admiral Van Tromp, who, in the mighty life and death struggle between Holland and Spain, and in the 2 wars with England, the first when Cromwell ruled, the second when the second Charles was on the throne, held up the fame and glory of Holland. In one case he swept the proud navies of Spain from the seas and carried the Dutch flag around the world. In the other, he was only vanquished after stubborn sea fights lasting for days, and only ended then because the stout admiral lay on his deck with an English bullet in his heart. This Van Tromp was the heir of the fame and the wealth of all the Van Tromps, and both had gone on accumulating for 300 years. The self-styled Countess knew all this, and, as the sequel shows, knew her man. She was 40, had been beautiful, was still comely, with good figure, fair-haired, but with steel-blue eyes. She spoke many languages, and had dwelt in every land from Petersburg to Paris. It is needless to tell how they first met, or of the intimacy that sprang up between them, but I will merely say in passing that within 5 days of their first meeting, he had given her a magnificent diamond bracelet, which had been in his family more than a century. This alarmed his 2 daughters, who were terrified at the mere suspicion that their father was in earnest, and might possibly present them with a stepmother, above all, a comparatively young stepmother, and, so far as physique went, a magnificent animal with promise of a long life, so long that her rights of dower would make a cut in the Van Tromp estates and treasures, which might well cause the old admiral to rouse himself from his 3-century sleep in Dordrecht church, and once more walk these glimpses of the moon in protest of the sacrilege. Then the scandal of a countess, adventuress becoming a Van Tromp, head of that family too. They knew of his penchant for the countess, and cared nothing for it, until, with a feeling akin to horror, they observed at the dress ball one night the countess airing the historic bracelet. It would require a volume to relate the scenes that followed in the Van Tromp domicile on this paralysing discovery. But prayers, tears, and histrionic touches were all met by the stolid reply of Van Tromp, "I please myself." As a last resort, the daughters appealed to the countess, offering all their ready cash and a pension if she would only disappear. But visions of the Van Tromp diamonds and of the Van Tromp bank account were in her head, and she was deaf to every appeal. In fact, she despised these heavy, matter-of-fact Dutch ladies, and rather gloried to think that she would soon be the female head of the Van Tromp house and stepmother to these 2 highly respectable dames, who would perforce have to live in her shadow. But then, of course, the Countess was a woman, and it is to be feared that even good women love to triumph over others. She, of course, could have no love for this portly old gentleman of 70, but it is pitiful to think he was madly infatuated. The poor old man, in spite of his unromantic appearance, had warm blood in his veins and plenty of romance in his heart. At last, in spite of gossip and opposition, they were married, and then, instead of settling down, as the happy groom had hoped, to a life of wedded bliss in one of his country houses at Dordrecht, Lady Van Tromp insisted on spending her honeymoon in Paris. There they went, and the very day of their arrival, the bride resumed a liaison with a beggarly count, who, not being an actual criminal, yet was written black enough in the books of the Paris police, and for whom the Countess had as warm an admiration as one of her cold, calculating nature was capable of feeling. Van Tromp speedily found his dream of bliss blown to the winds. But he was not so blind as not to see that his wife not only did not love him, but was false to him as well. Poor old Van Tromp felt he had made his last throw for happiness, and hoping against hope, dreamed she in time would learn to appreciate his devotion and would love him, and so tried to persuade himself of her truth. The first anniversary of the marriage found them at Baden, and there the unhappy husband, thinking to give his wife a pleasant surprise, entered her chamber at an unusual hour, bearing a diamond necklace for a present, and found her in a position which could no longer leave any doubt as to her faithlessness. Seizing a chair, he felled her companion, who never stirred again, but the shock was too great for the husband, who himself fell to the floor and instantly expired. The doctors said of heart disease, and I think they were right. This event was only a few weeks old. The will had been read, and it was found that he had literally left everything to my wife, Elizabeth. Here, my friend, the chief of police and a distant relative of Van Tromp, came to the front, determined quietly on his own account to investigate Lady Van Tromp. He found this last was at least her third venture on the stormy sea of matrimony. He had a fancy that some one of her husbands might still be living and undiscovered. If this could be proved, then her marriage to Van Tromp was no marriage, and the ducats, dollars and diamonds bequeathed by Van Tromp to my wife Elizabeth would instantly melt into air. Into very thin air, so far as the Countess was concerned, provided, of course, they had not actually passed into her clutches. In fact, they were legally hers, for the will had been admitted to probate. Those of the family objecting could offer no valid opposition, and she had been put in possession, but, by a strange neglect on her part, left everything intact, save a deposit of 300,000 gulden in the Bank of Amsterdam, which she secured and set out for Naples with a new lover. The detective, whom I will call Amstel, discovered that she had first been married when only 15 years old to a young Swiss in Geneva, who soon left her and fled to America. He had subsequently returned to Europe, but Amstel was unable to discover his whereabouts or if he was living. He suspected that the Swiss was not only alive but in communication with the Countess, and that she, in fact, might be his legal wife. He had followed the Countess from Naples to Paris. There she left her lover, and was now on her way to Nuremberg, as Amstel believed, to meet her first husband. But she had arranged to remain a few days with some old friends of hers. Every movement she made there would be watched, while Amstel, going on to Cologne to look up some clues, intended to wait there until informed that she had departed, and when the train arrived at Cologne he proposed to enter it and follow my lady on, hoping to witness a meeting between her and the much-hoped for husband. Happily, we had arrived at Cologne at this point in the story, and as Amstel was to remain here, we had to say goodbye. But for the whole 20 minutes of my stay we walked up and down the platform talking eagerly of the case. I had become much interested, so deeply indeed, that had I had leisure, I certainly should have turned amateur detective and joined Amstel. The train started, and, promising to write me in New York the outcome of the case, we shook hands warmly and parted. He wrote me twice, and the following year I returned to Europe and met Amstel at Brussels. We had a very delightful time together, during which he told me the sequel of the Van Tromp episode. Instead of one, the Countess had 2 husbands living, but the Van Tromps preferred to buy off the woman at a good round sum rather than have a public scandal. Amstel interviewed the Countess and gave her the choice between arrest and a full release of all claims on the Van Tromp property for the sum of 100,000 gulden. She made a hard fight, but at last gave in gracefully. But my chapter has grown too long already, and I will close it with the remark that I myself met the lady at Wiesbaden in 1871 and became acquainted with the brilliant adventuress. She will appear again in the sequel,